Imagine a lake so large it once covered over 600 square miles, big enough to make it the largest lake west of the Mississippi. But what happens when it disappears? And more importantly, what happens when it comes back? This is the Tulare Lake, located in Southern California. Hello, listeners, and welcome to H2O and Beyond. My name is Alex Hahn, and each week we dive into the science, systems, and stories behind the water we use every day. In today's episode, I'm joined by three guests actually from the Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership, who are going to give us insight into what the lake once was, the geography of the area, and its unique behavior and what it's like over there right now. Hey guys, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you all on the show.
Good afternoon.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
I think now is a great time where we can let our listeners know what the Tulare Lake is, and tell us a little bit about the history and the actual watershed itself. So I think I'm going to hand the microphone over to Mr. Austin. And so, Mr. Austin, my first question would be, for our listeners who've never heard of the lake, what is the Tulare Lake?
It's a hole in the ground. It's sort of like Death Valley. It's the lowest point around, and so all the water flows down to it. It's hard to tackle this without, to some extent, tackling the geography of California.
Mm-hmm.
California, at least for those of us who live near the Central Valley, it seems like the whole place is built around the Central Valley, which is an enormous valley that's flat on the bottom, not like there's a river that runs through it, and mountains on all the sides. It's rectangular. It's about 400 miles north to south, which is pretty big. And even at that, it only takes up a portion of the state. And the bottom third of the Central Valley is where we're located. If you divide the entire state up into hydrologic districts so it can be managed for water purposes, the Tulare Lake Basin, which is named for Tulare Lake, is the biggest of all the basins in the state, and it uses the most water. When Larry was introducing himself, he referred to the San Joaquin Valley Desert, and all of this area that we're in is literally a desert. When people first showed up here, it didn't have enough water, precipitation to grow things except in a few isolated wetlands. And if you look at it from the amount of precipitation that comes down a year, it's generally less than 10 inches. So you're in a desert, but you've got land, you've got sunshine. It's a great place to grow stuff. You just need water. And so we take all the water we can get that is ours, and then we get everybody else's water that we can and bring it down here as well. This particular basin, and maybe, I don't know, many of the basins have a natural outlet from them. So water flows in on one side and flows out on another. But Tulare Lake, since the end of the 1800s, has been a closed basin that by and large water flows in and it never leaves. We use all the water we can get. So we've got mountains on three sides of us, east, west, and south, down towards Los Angeles, that box in this huge valley of 15,000 square miles or so, 16, 17,000. But on the north side, it's just a high rise of ground. And the reason we typically don't flood out at all is we use so much water, it can accumulate. But if it's just a huge deluge and fills the place up, it will eventually flow over the ridge to our north and head on up towards San Francisco. So that's what Tulare Lake Basin is that whole unit where people live, their cities, their highways, their railroads. And then the name thing, the lake itself, which was upwards of maybe as close to 800 square miles at time, is in the center of that. It's at the bottom of the valley. So when there's nowhere else for water to flow, it winds up down there.
So essentially, California is like, you got mountains on three sides of the Tulare Basin, and so water flows in from the top, and it flows in, and you guys use all the water, so it never leaves. Is that right?
That's sort of it. Our water, by and large, comes from the Pacific Ocean, particularly from around Hawaii, the tropics. and it comes in half a dozen, if we're lucky, half a dozen big storms a year. So you have this moisture moving across the Pacific,
Hmm.
and it can come from the far side of the Pacific, but you have a band of water called an atmospheric river, which is a few hundred miles across and is easy enough for satellites to see, but hard for you and me. And when it comes over to California, it goes till it hits the first big hill, which is either the Coast Ranges, that's snuggled up near the ocean, or it's the Sierra Nevada. And the higher waters like that, clouds are pushed up over a mountain, the more they're going to drop. So almost everything gets wrung out of those water systems as they go over the Sierra. And on the other side is Nevada, and it's dry because we're taking all the water.
I see. And what was the most recent sort of disappearance of this lake, and why did it happen?
It is really hard to describe that. We've got we'll get into it later, but we've got records going back to the 1850s that are really pretty good records. And the lake elevation, you can either measure the size of the lake by the elevation, how deep it is, or by the land area. And you can calculate from that volume, but people don't use volume too much. It's generally the amount of area that is covered. Um, as soon as we started keeping records of how high the lake was, it became apparent that the lake was never the same elevation for 2 years in a row. It was always either going up or going down. And my sense is it's much the same way if you're out in the Serengeti at a big water hole. You've either got a flood that delivers river water down to a water hole that fills up this massive thing, or you've had a year or two of drought and it's getting harder and harder to find water. And that's what Tulare Lake is. It's a place sitting at the bottom of this 16,000 square mile basin. And when water comes down off the Sierra in four big rivers, it would go right to that lake and fill it up. Everything around it would be a desert. It would be dry and crunchy and miserable, although Larry and Rob would enjoy it out there. But you had something that was vaguely similar to the Everglades, where you had these five natural lakes, one of which is Tulare Lake, and a lot of wetland plants around them, most particularly tules, Tules, which are bulrushes that were up to 20 feet high and a couple feet in diameter. And the Native Americans lived everywhere around here, but there was a particularly dense population of them living around the lakes and in the wetlands. And those wetlands were connected in a chain all the way up to San Francisco.
I see. And now that I think about it, why? So before you mentioned that this lake, it used to go up and down. Like the since we started keeping records, the elevation of the lake has never quite stayed the same. Why is that?
Yeah, and it can go through dramatic changes. There was no particular rhyme or reason.
Hmm.
It was almost random as to which years are going to be wet years and which years are going to be dry years. And just once in a rare while, you get two back-to-back wet years. And so you would wind up with a wet year delivering an enormous amount of water from the Sierra down to the lake. And it could raise, this is a 40-mile long lake. That's a big lake. And it could raise that lake in 15 feet in one big storm or group of storms. And then over the next 5, 10, 15 years, you'd see the lake level go down, 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 and then in come another big storm, raises it back up. The bottom of the lake is coated with clay, and so almost no water goes down through Tulare Lake into the groundwater. Once you get down there, you either use the water to grow crops, and farmers are ingenious at using water to make money, or this is a hot place. This is hotter than Georgia by a good bit. And that water gradually evaporates and it goes over the Sierra. So a lot of the water that is present on the east side of the Sierra, out there where there's dry country, and this is out towards Four Corners, Colorado, New Mexico, Utah, Arizona. A lot of that water comes from what we use here, and they evaporate and send over the top.
I see. And so is this why we had, back-to-back wet years in 2023 and you saw news headlines saying, "Hey, the lake is officially back." Is that why?
No, I think most of the time when the lake is level is going up, since we've been looking at it at the late 1840s, it's gone up for a single flood year, not back-to-back flood years. So it's going up and then it's gradually going down. If you get two back-to-back flood years, then it keeps it high for an unusually long period of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So right in 2023, they just had one big flood year.
Yeah, there were three floods that came through. I live up in the foothills, the bottom of the Sierra to the west of the lake. And we had one good storm that got our attention coming through in mid-January. And then we had two big storms in March. And they caused localized flooding and some damage here, but mostly we just sent the water down to the valley bottom, the Tulare Lake Basin, where the people live. And gradually that water got closer and closer. The flatter the river is, the slower the water's going to go. But it was all heading toward Tulare Lake. So they had plenty of notice that all this water was coming. And farmers have a huge infrastructure here. That's first, there's the federal government as the first line of defense. Each of the four rivers has a big federal reservoir paid by our tax dollars to catch that water, to prevent flooding down below, and to provide water for growing crops once the flood season is past. So those reservoirs would fill up. But then once it's full, the managers have to be releasing water so they're ready to catch the next flood. So that water's pulsing on down towards Tulare Lake. And the big landowners and the people who are into management, like city owners and stuff, could see what was coming their way. Farmers would take out as much water as they could. There are canals all over this flat valley that pull water out of the rivers and put it into holding basins, settling basins, so that the water will go down through these basins. Think of them as square ponds and recharge the groundwater down below. So water was taken out everywhere we could. Water was being sent to every holding spot we could get in, but it was still clear it was aimed at those people down in the lake bottom.
And over what period of time did this happen? Was this a sudden event?
Well, each of those three floods felt kind of sudden because, if you're out in it, you're going to get soaking wet.
Mm-hmm.
But it took months. It took, there were times when the lake level was rising faster than others, but it took months for all that water to get down there and to sort of find a home. And as soon as it peaked, then it started going back down again. And until you've seen this place, it's hard to realize just how managed it is. When American folks got here, Europeans, and I know the Spanish are Europeans as well, but when the Americans got here from back east, what they found was a lake that just naturally went up and down. And as it was going up, it would cover more land. As it was going down, it would expose more land. But these farmers realized pretty quickly, as they do everywhere, the lake bottoms are good places to grow crops. So they started growing crops and they would get flooded out. And what they did in the late 1800s and the first 2 decades of the 1900s were to build cells, C-E-L-L-S, down in the lake bottom. And you're just putting levees up using mules to put a mound of dirt, like something you'd use to hold the enemy out, on all four sides of a big, big field. And those individual levees, when, they're people aren't working together, everybody's working for their own benefit in many cases. And so the levee is intended to keep your field dry. And as long as your levee is higher and stronger than the next guy, his levee will fail when the flood gets there. He'll be flooded out and you'll be able to raise your crop. And then we wound up with a really nasty drought in the 1920s. It was before the Dust Bowl that got the Great Plains, but it was so dry that the farmers, the big farmers, and these are big, big farmers down in the lake bed, realized they needed a reservoir to hold water for dry times. So they built the first reservoir inside the lake. And now what you've had ever since then, for over a century now, is you've had these cells, some of which are devoted for storing water that they need to grow things. Some of these cells are used to hold water that's been polluted from agricultural use or something else, or from selenium or something like that that's in the ground that got mixed in with the water. So they use them as evaporation basins because you don't want to contaminate the groundwater, but you get rid of the water. And other cells are used to grow crops. And in a really, really wet year, when we can't find enough water to put anywhere else, and this has been true since the late 1890s, that water goes down. And some of those cells that were meant to grow crops or to hold a city or whatever are going to get flooded. If the floods come during harvest season, then you would get in there and the landowners would figure out which ones are most vulnerable, and they would harvest that. And then as they pulled all their harvest equipment over the levee into the next cell, they would blow the levee that kept that cell dry. And so then the lake could expand. So it's not a lake like you think of anywhere else, or almost nowhere else. It's got this grid pattern in it. So you just decide, whoever is in charge, and that's a tricky thing, you decide where you want to put water. If you have orchards that you're growing crops in, and you know you put water there, you're going to lose 20 years worth of work building those orchards. So those might be some of the last ones that you would flood. But if you've got tomatoes growing out there, oh, well, you lose a crop of tomatoes, so you might want to flood that one sooner.
Mm-hmm.
And when this flood was being, or whatever it is, the return of the lake in 2023 was being described, it was often being described from the standpoint of satellites because that was the easiest information. So you knew the boundary of the lake bed at its fullest, around 790 square miles, and you looked how much of that was covered with water. And so some people thought of that, particularly the state of California, as that's the return of the lake, that's the size of the flood. But the people who were living there, many of them were going, well, that's just the reservoir for this community. We always keep that water there, or we always keep water over here. But if you were living in a place where suddenly one morning you got up and your field and your house was underwater, that felt like a flood. And sometimes, you could say, well, it's because water is flowing down from the high country. And other times you could say the guy who has enough power to control the levees is opening the cell and diverting water onto my property because he's the son of a gun. It was not a smooth thing with how the lake bed got flooded that year. And it's been that way for the last 100 years. Not infrequently involving shotguns and dynamite.
So I guess this flooding is all relative because I mean it's always happened in the past. Now it's just these days it just sort of made the headlines.
Yeah, but we have an awful short memory. This started well before the Civil War, that people would think the lake is never going to come back and be as big as it was in 15 years ago. And then in one night, everything floods and you have to run for your life.
And I think this provides a great transition into sort of the ecosystem of the lake, which I'll hand that off to Mr. Saslaw in a second. Sorry, Mr. Hansen.
That's okay. Yeah.
Hey, Mr. Hansen. So, now can you tell us a bit about what the ecosystem there is like now and what makes it sort of unique compared to other ecosystems?
Sure. Let me just share sort of a point of view idea before I describe those ecosystems. During the years that folks like John and Larry and I have lived and worked in the valley, we probably all have a slightly different sense for the valley in terms of its beauty, its aesthetics. And I would say that many people who visit the Tulare Lake Basin for the first time have a little bit of trouble finding out sort of why people like us spend time looking to try to protect habitats and wildlife in an area that to many people is kind of ugly. It's a like we've heard already, it's ecologically, it's a desert. It gets much of it gets less than 11 inches of rain a year. But to me, what's fascinating about it is that in its natural state, it was not like anywhere else in the world. Not exactly. As John said already, most years when the lake would have water in it, that water would either disappear by evaporation or use by the local vegetation. But there were years where the lake was full enough, if we had enough of those atmospheric river storms, if we had a high enough snowpack in the Sierra. As John said, that was the main source of the water that flowed into the lake. Even though mountains were on three sides, very little was contributed from the Coast Range or the Tehachapis to the south. It was primarily water coming out of the Sierra. So I'm mentioning that because if you can picture a desert with, as John said, 5 named lakes in it, the biggest one is the one that we all grew up calling Tulare Lake. That came from a word that came from the Nahuatl language, the Aztecs of central Mexico. It was their word for reeds and rushes and plants that have just sort of a skinny, almost look like long green fingers, like John said, like 15, 20 feet out of water. So a tule that came from their word tulin was the kind of plant that grew in tule marshes, and that they had a name for that. They called them tulares or tulare, and that's how Tulare County and the Tule River and Tule Fog and the city of Tulare, they all got their name from that Aztec word. Now, it had a different name before the Spanish came there because the native people, the Yokuts, had lived there. Their way of describing it is since time immemorial, and their name for it is a name that we all learned just 3 years ago. I had never heard in all my growing up years and all my years studying Tulare Lake, I had never heard the word Pa'ashi. And that's the name that they've been using for 3 years because that's the word that they use for that. That's a word that can describe a lake, an ocean, the sea. It literally means big water. And so that was the name that they gave to this huge expanse of water. As John said, the largest freshwater lake west of the Mississippi. Salt Lake in Utah is bigger than Tulare Lake ever was, but it's a salty lake and it did not support freshwater fishes because it was way too salty for, those kinds of things. But Tulare Lake, I'll rattle off a short set of numbers here. Over 400 different kinds of vertebrates were native species in that area. And that's kind of hard to imagine, but 12 native fishes, 4 kinds of amphibians, 20 reptile species, 360 kinds of birds, of which 45 were wetland birds that nested in aquatic habitats in the Tulare Lake Basin, and 40 species of mammals. So that's a tremendous variety of critters living on land that literally differed only by inches and feet in terms of how high the ground was. When people visit the valley, one of the things that they often leave impressed with is how you can quickly go from one kind of plant community, one kind of habitat to another by literally going uphill 5 or 6 inches. And that much change within the Central Valley of California is as much change as you have to, visit states where there are mountain ranges separating these places. But the point I was going to try to make earlier about sort of the acquired taste, sort of seeing and finding the beauty in that area, is that it was a desert with lakes in it. And that meant that it had remarkable dramatic contrast between things like fishes being eaten by pelicans in the lake, and then just a few hundred meters beyond the edge of those tule marshes that surrounded the lake were things like roadrunners and scorpions and kangaroo rats, things that people think of when they think of desert ecosystems. So the ecosystems were quite varied. I'm going to use the word pa'ashi because I like that. To me, it's very descriptive of the place. There were at least 3 what we call upland ecosystems. Those were grassland, which can be called prairie. There was another type of ground called desert scrub, and that was the most common upland ecosystem in the desert portions of the valley that Larry can probably expand upon as well. And there were woodlands, primarily of a tree called valley oak, that grew in uplands near waterways, but typically a little bit away from active streams. The aquatic habitats included forests. The dominant forest type was one that's often called a willow cottonwood forest, very much like what you might find along streams in Arizona. There was also a type of forest called valley oak riparian woodland. Woodland actually is a little different than forest. It has, instead of a closed canopy where you're sort of always under, shady leaves and kind of blocks out the sky, a woodland has much more open vegetation. But there were places where that woodland grew in shallow water. It would have been called by some people a swamp, similar to what you might find in Louisiana or, South Carolina. So riparian forest, oak woodland, freshwater marsh where the tules and the cattails grew, a particular ecosystem called alkali sink scrub. The dominant plant there was one with a not too fancy sounding name called iodine bush. And those are places where water would flood them when the lake was full. Water would then recede along those shallow gradients back into the lake, often leaving minerals behind, minerals that had come from the Sierra. When fresh water comes off glacier and snow carries minerals down to the valley with it. And among those are minerals that make the soil salty. There was also alkali marsh was a wetland, and a special wetland called vernal pools. And then the biggest one of all was open water, where no plants grew. That was habitat for lots and lots of fishes, but because of how deep it was, sometimes up to 30 feet or more, there were no plants growing in that particular ecosystem. So I named off 7 aquatic habitats, 3 upland habitats, a remarkable mosaic of natural lands filled with wildlife. And the speed with which that changed was so fast that we unfortunately did not ever get a chance to really accurately document what all of those different ecosystems were like before they began to disappear. It was a very, very rapid process. It was probably the only thing faster was the disappearance of the native people. Starting in the 1830s when things like malaria arrived in Central California, even before the gold rush, populations of indigenous people were reduced by over 80% very, very quickly. And then other diseases came. And then as settlers arrived, all those sort of, pressures from the, arrival of settlers looking for land, they were displaced from their land in a big hurry. So very rapid changes in the native peoples, very rapid changes in the ecosystem, very rapid changes in the species that inhabited all those different ecosystems. So I did that very quickly. I know there probably are some particular things that you're curious about, Alex. Like, I mean, the place I'm describing, the place that John has already described, as he said, it's somewhere on the order of 16 to 17,000 square miles. That's basically like adding together Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware, with a few square miles left over. People in the eastern U.S. can kind of imagine, that size of a landscape. In the central part of the country, if people picture the upper peninsula of Michigan, that's about the size of the Tulare Lake hydrological region. The floor of the valley where the water arrives, the part that we call the floodplain, but that includes the watershed, the high areas that catch that water that John described coming off the Pacific. They capture it as either snow at the high elevations or rain in the lower elevations. That's the stuff that comes roaring down those 4 big rivers and a few smaller creeks to create that amazing complex of wetland and upland habitats that was there originally.
And what are some of the most interesting fish or animals that have lived here before in the past?
Yeah, a lot of people describe the Tulare Basin as being something like the Serengeti of California. Unfortunately, grizzly bear, which was that would have been the apex predator, they're extinct in California. It exists now on the flag of the state, but there are none roaming around the mountains or the valleys. But imagine a place where the number of elk, deer, very,
Mhm.
very large, called Thule elk that lived and flourished in those wetlands around the lake. They were being preyed on by wolves, by grizzly bears, by mountain lions. And then in the lake itself, the fishes that occurred in the lake included things like trout and salmon and sturgeon, which are huge fish, sometimes over 10 feet long. But those populations were some of the first things to disappear because if you imagine a basin, a shallow basin, almost like a dinner plate, getting more and more shallow, with that increasing shallowness of the lake, the salinity of the lake began to increase. Now, I want to clarify that saline water or alkaline water is not necessarily a death knell to wildlife. There's an amazing author in California named Peter Moyle, who's the expert on fishes in California. And in an essay that he wrote a couple of years ago when the lake came back, he reminded us that the lake's ability to support abundant life was partly because it was somewhat alkaline. It said the water would have been somewhat alkaline, and evidence shows that tolerance for high alkalinities is found in native California fishes. And so the fishes that were there originally, most of them are gone. They've been replaced by game fish that were brought in by settlers, things like largemouth bass and brown trout and a whole bunch of other game species, carp and crappie and sunfish and bluegills. So there are lots and lots of very popular game fish in the state today, and they come back when water returns to the Tulare Lake Basin. They basically get carried into the lake by stream flow from the Sierra, but the fish diversity has changed. So the fish that were there originally would have included things like Thule perch and a number of other native minnows that were in the Tulare Lake, squawfish and blackhead, and they were the food of white pelicans, which were a huge, web-footed swimming bird that ate the native fishes there. And they have a 10-foot wingspread, and they used to nest on islands in the lake. So, even that's a hard thing to imagine. A desert with lakes in it. So that makes the lake sort of like an island already, an island of wetness in a dry land. And then in the middle of that, middle of a lake, now you've got islands where predators can't go. The coyotes can't swim there. So pelicans can lay their eggs right on the ground. Those eggs are safe. Their chicks hatch without any predators out there to take them. And there used to be thousands of white pelicans nesting on islands in the Tulare Lake. So to me, imagining Thule elk, grizzly bears, white pelicans, there were snakes in the Tulare Lake Basin called giant garter snake, and there's evidence that they grew to be the biggest snakes in North America. There is a kind of a bivalve called the California floater, a kind of a mussel that was an important food item for the yokuts, along with things like Western pond turtle. So the lake was filled with things that provided livelihood for the native people. They were known to be very peaceable within their own tribes, but with neighboring tribes. There was a lot of trade and commerce in the central part of California, very little intertribal warfare like we might think of if we're thinking of Plains Indians on horseback. So the valley was rich with wildlife that provided an abundance of food. The Yokuts didn't even have a word in their language for starvation because, if it was a year where maybe the fish population wasn't so good, they could rely on upland game like, jackrabbits and cottontails and mule deer and that sort of thing. So it was a really, really remarkable place that changed very quickly.
Hmm. And while we're on the topic of these native people, I think it'd be a great chance to tell us a bit more about all the native populations there and how they've learned to live with Pashi, like you said. And yeah.
Yeah, the most of the Tulare Valley was inhabited by Yokuts. They have shared languages. There were tribes that lived their entire life right around the Tulare Lake. A group that Larry and John and I work quite a bit with is called the Tachi Yokuts, Tachi. One of the old original names for Tulare Lake was called Tachi, and the Yokuts actually believed that it was two lakes. They would sometimes describe Tachi, which is their word for a water bird called the American coot.
Mhm.
It's a blackish, kind of grayish black bird with a white bill and not web feet, but lobed feet that allow it to swim in the water. They live around the Tulare Lake. The coots live around the lake all year long. And so the Tachi named their own tribe after that particular bird because they admired the fact that that this is a bird that could survive and make its living at around the lake all year long, and they lived around that lake for the entire year. Other tribes just east of there, for example, along the Kaweah River in the Visalia area, is a tribe called the Wauchumni tribe, and they were to them, Pashi was also very important, but they did not live there year round. They lived primarily in the oak forests that were east of the Tulare Lake. There were other groups in the southern part of the valley that lived along the Kern River. There were other groups that lived along the Kings River. There were even Yokuts that lived on the islands in the Tulare Lake, and one of their tribal names was the Wowol, Wowol. That was their name for beaver because beaver was one of the native mammals that lived in shallow wetlands in the valley. In Central California, because of the heat, they did not do like most Americans picture and build, beaver dams. They typically built their homes in sort of muddy banks of wetlands. They might have, had a burrow into the shore of the Tulare Lake if there was a little bit of high ground. That was often where they would find their shelter. And so the beaver, the Wowol people, they lived on islands in the Tulare Lake. And the island is now a community called Alpaugh. And Alpaugh is on a strip of high ground called the Alpaugh Sand Ridge that separated Tachi Lake, Coot Lake, from Tontachi, which meant Little Coot. It was a smaller body of water on the south side of that ridge. Now, when the water got deep enough, those two separate bodies of water would join around the edges
Mhm.
and envelop the ridge so that the ridge became an island. So, I've named some of the tribes, but there were dozens, and they lived all the way from the Delta up at where Stockton, California is. That was in the San Joaquin Valley. But from a place called Mendota Pool on the San Joaquin River, all the way from the San Joaquin River to the Tehachapis, were a number of groups that survived primarily on the acorn from valley oak trees.
Mhm.
That was one of their major staple foods, but parts of tule plants were edible. They gathered native fruits like California blackberry, wild rose, and they had a number of other edible plants that came primarily from grasses and things that most people would call wildflowers. There were a lot of bulbs that the native people would dig up from underground, and those were really, very, very nutritious and a lot of protein. So the languages of the people were similar, and outside of that Yokuts grouping, they traded with Chumash Indians that lived along the coast of California. That's how the Yokuts would get jewelry, things like pismo clam and abalone, things that they found to be beautiful that they would fashion into some of the beads on their necklaces. But on the floor of the valley, as John mentioned, the land under the Tulare Lake is an impermeable clay. There was no material out there to make arrowheads from. So almost all the Yokuts traded with Paiutes that literally had to carry obsidian over the High Sierra, and they came down into the Central Valley. And one of the things that they valued that was a natural resource of the Yokuts people was saltgrass. And saltgrass is a native grass that grows in the salty ground around Tulare Lake. And Yokuts to this day treasure that material. If they know of a place where there's a good stand of saltgrass, they, sort of keep it quiet. It's sort of a, secret place for them to gather this material that they use for their families. They use it as a gift for friends. They use it, traditionally it was used to season and to preserve food, and before the days of refrigeration. So, they had learned across the millennia by watching wild creatures. They had learned how to make use of plants for food, for medicine, for fiber, for construction. So they were intimately connected with, all that rich ecological fabric of the valley, all the different critters that lived there and interacted together. Yokuts still consider the lake to be a living thing. One of the efforts underway on behalf of a group called the Pa'ashi Coalition is the consideration of exploring whether or not there's some way to find legal status for the lake as a living being. So, and this is something that has been done in Northern California in recent years, for example.
I see. And I think I'll hand it back to Mr. Sazal now, who can talk about some of the human impacts of the lake and how those have shaped the lives of those living around.
So we have this very unique both flora and fauna that is in the Tulare Basin, but is representative of California, where, west of the Sierra Nevada, we have such diversity of plants and plant communities. There's more species west of the Sierra Nevada than the whole eastern third of the United States because of the soils and climate and just the ability through evolutionary processes. So what we have is a very unique place, but it's a place of very high demand for the socioeconomics of growing much of the nation's and even some of the world's crops. And so for the Tulare Basin Watershed Partnership, we as with our wildlife interests, have been directed by just being in the communities and looking at the future. How can we have both sustainable and resilient both farm use on the valley floor, but the watersheds that provide the water that are the engine of this huge agricultural agribusiness economy. How can we have a future that the watersheds of the Sierra Nevada, starting with the snowpack and the snow melt that fills the reservoirs and all those canals, how can we have a sustainable socioeconomic and communities when all of this is essentially threatened? So we have been embarking really since 2017 on trying to take a headwaters to groundwater approach.
Mr. Sazal, since you're the last speaker, I'd actually like you to do the closing of the episode and tell us, what gives you hope about the future of the lake.
Well, I think that the lake, it is as it is. It sits in the low spot. We're going to have floods. The projections are that atmospheric river events, which in some cases are rain on snow at higher elevations, those things are going to happen. How can we, engage communities that are at risk from floods like we saw in 2023? How can we make sure our infrastructure is resilient to floods? So I'm just hopeful that people will understand that they have, something at stake and are therefore stakeholders in what the future of this place looks like, using the best science, the social sciences, the natural resource sciences, help from everybody from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory looking at imagery from space as to what's going on, but also the University of California, UC Merced, and the specialists they have there in hydrology and watersheds, all the wildlife and socioeconomic specialists that we have. I think that people are gonna want to participate in their own future if we can provide the mechanism, one of many mechanisms for people's welfare, understanding that things are changing and we've got to get at it.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sazal, and everyone else who joined us on the podcast today. It was a pleasure having you on the show.
Thank you.
Well, listeners, hopefully you enjoyed this overview of the Tulare Lake Basin and the watershed and all the great work that the Watershed Partnership does. If you found this episode helpful, please share it with your coworkers and friends. And if you want to be a guest on the podcast or have any episode suggestions, there'll be a Google form link down in the description below. I'll also link some more resources to the Watershed Partnership that will help you guys learn more as well if you want. And as always, stay connected with the H2O and Beyond socials. I'm Alex Hahn. Stay curious and stay hydrated.